Welcome to Fatal Files podcast, where we delve into case files about true crime and mystery. Get comfortable, put your feet up, or snuggle into bed, or listen on the way to work. Let's jump right in as we hear the story of the life of Marybeth Tinning, killer mother. None of Tinning's children was safe. She killed her sons and daughters and showed no particular remorse for them. Tinning had plenty of support as she went to trial. She did time in prison and she was released. Yes, Marybeth Tinning was released from the women's prison in the state of New York. Now, you may be like me. Many people struggle to understand why Marybeth Tinning kept killing her children. And we also wonder why she and how she got away with it for so long. Still, many of us wonder how a person who committed such awful acts could ever be released from prison. So let's go back and learn a little bit about Marybeth's background. She was born Marybeth Rowe in Duxbury, New York on September 11th, 1942. Duxbury is a very small town, still is today, in north-central New York, where Marybeth was born. Many of the young men of the area, including Marybeth's father, went off to fight in Europe and in the Pacific during World War II. While their sisters and mothers and wives contributed by working in area factories. When the war was over, Marybeth's father returned home and took a job in one of the factories. Life was stable for her. It was early 1950s and then into the 60s where she grew up. She got everything she needed in terms of material possessions. And Duxbury was a very safe and quiet town. Marybeth wasn't a standout student in terms of academics, but she did stand out for her looks. In her late teens, Marybeth was 5'4", petite, with blonde hair and sparkling blue eyes. She was a quiet girl, but she still had her pick of young men in the area, and she chose Joe Tinning. Although Joe wasn't exactly the most charismatic or the best looking or the most popular guy in town, he was pretty stable. He was a very hard worker, he didn't drink very much, and he was not a womanizer. He was exactly the type of guy that somebody wanted to settle down with in the 1960s. The two began dating and married in 1965, while Joe worked in the factories while Marybeth worked as a nurse's aide. Everything seemed to be going well, but underneath the surface there were problems rumbling. Marybeth was a very jealous woman and very paranoid. When Joe came home late from work, she would give him the third degree and accuse him of cheating on her. Marybeth decided to take things into her own hands. Marybeth gave Joe a nearly deadly dose of barbiturates. The poisoning was discovered after Joe went to the emergency room and the police were called. But in a pattern that would repeat itself for the subsequent 30 years, Joe refused to hold his wife accountable. The incident illustrated the relationship that Marybeth and Joe had, that the power dynamics were clearly on Marybeth's side. She was the one that wore the pants. Although Joe had been a spineless individual who seemed to let his wife walk all over him, he even let her kill their children. The poisoning should have been a wake-up call for the authorities, and indeed to Joe. Authorities should have investigated more, but they didn't. Joe didn't want to press any charges with the poisoning, so the Tinnings continued on with their marriage as normal. They continued to work and they continued to be sociable in their community. Most people who work in the healthcare industry are nurturing types. They enter the field because they care about their fellow human beings and they want to alleviate suffering. Marybeth Tinning was a healthcare worker who on the outside appeared to be a very caring person. She was diligent at her job and well liked by her fellow workers and loved by her patients. But underneath there was a very disturbing thing going on. She was violent by nature, and she enjoyed the suffering of others. Marybeth had a deep urge to kill, but instead of preying on her patients, she preferred to enact her murderous desires upon her family. Barbara was the first child in the Tinnings household. She was born in 1967, about 2 years after Marybeth and Joe were married. She was a happy child, and the Tinnings seemed to be quite happy together at that time. Marybeth was outwardly a good mother, doting on Barbara whenever they were in public. In 1970, Joe Jr. was born, and it seemed as though the Tinning family was well on their way of being the all-American family. Marybeth told her family and friends that she planned to have more children, but the reality was that there were plenty of problems beneath the surface. Marybeth began giving Joe a hard time by the early 70s while masking her darker side in public. She was about to begin her domestic killing spree. The Tinnings welcomed their third child, Jennifer, into the family in December 1971. Marybeth appeared happy with her third child, but a mere 8 days later, she rushed Jennifer into the local emergency room. Jennifer was unresponsive. Jennifer was dead. The doctors examined her and pronounced that it was meningitis and brain abscesses that killed her. Although this was truly tragic, the life went on as normal in the Tinning home. Joe and Marybeth gone back to work so they could care for their 2 surviving children. Then, just over a year later, on January the 20th, 1972, Joe Jr. was brought into the emergency room, unresponsive. He died that night, and what was ruled as a cardio arrest. He simply stopped breathing. The chances of lightning striking twice in the same home were extremely low, but just a few weeks after Joe Jr. died, it struck the Tinnings' house a 3rd time. Barbara, who was not quite 5, was brought in to the emergency room, unresponsive, and later died. Her death was ruled to be the result of Ray's syndrome. To the outsider, it looks like that the Tinning family were either very unlucky or something nefarious was taking place. The reality was that something nefarious was indeed taking place. Marybeth was killing her children one at a time, but no one, including her spineless husband, seemed to suspect her. Maybe it was her quiet personality, or possibly the fact that she's worked in healthcare that kept the local doctors and police from digging below the surface. After all, Marybeth Tinning and her husband were pillars of the society. Nothing bad could ever take place in their home. Any doubts in the local doctors had, or the law enforcement had, about Marybeth, they gradually were forgotten because the Tinnings didn't have any more children for Marybeth to kill. Remained childless for over a year until Marybeth became pregnant again in 1973. Marybeth gave birth to her 4th child, Timothy, on Thanksgiving Day, 1973. She brought Timothy home, and Marybeth and Joe's friends and family were overwhelmed and so happy, and congratulating them and supporting them and said, "You've turned the corner, and perhaps now your lovely son will make up for all the children that you have lost, and things will be normal for you." But But then, on December the 10th, when Timothy was only 2 weeks old, Marybeth had brought him into the emergency room, unresponsive. Marybeth was beginning to become a regular customer at the county hospital, but once again, there seemed to be a legitimate reason for the child's death. Timothy was pronounced with SIDS syndrome. Timothy's body showed no outward signs of trauma. He just stopped breathing. So they ruled that he was a victim of crib death or sudden infant death syndrome, SIDS. The tragic death of the Tinning children became the talk of people, including friends and family. And although many people in the area began to question how this is very strange and odd that this could happen to the same family, their closest to the couple continued to support them. The news came that Marybeth was pregnant again. After baby Nathan was born on March the 30th, 1975, which just happened to be Easter Sunday that year, friends and family of the Tinnings nervously awaited, and perhaps another tragedy was going to strike. But after a few months, it seemed that Nathan was thriving, and he would survive the Tinning curse. Then on September the 2nd, 1975, Beth came into the emergency room with an unresponsive Nathan. She told the doctors that Nathan had just stopped breathing, so she rushed him to hospital as fast as she could. The doctors could not revive Nathan, and based the fact that there was no outward trauma, combined with the story Marybeth gave them, that they ruled him too as a victim of SIDS. Years went on, and few people in the area who were suspicious of Marybeth Tinning and her quickly perishing children eventually forgot the tragedy and moved on with their lives. Even the people who were supposed to defend the children of the New York state forgot about the Tinnings. They failed in their due diligence in investigating Marybeth's background when she applied to adopt a child. Yes, you heard that right. Marybeth and Joan Tinning applied to adopt a child in 1978. They went through the process and submitted to a background check, which included a complete examination of criminal and financial records. Since Marybeth or Joe had no criminal records, they were both gainfully employed, they were stable financially, they easily passed the first round of adoption process. Then, a social worker interviewed the couple and visited the home to make sure that it was suitable for a child. The Tinnings also passed this part of the process with flying colours. One would think that the fact that all of the Tinnings' children died before the age of 5 would be a red flag to the social workers. But Marybeth assured them that they were all natural deaths and that she had the doctor's records to prove it. The state of New York allowed the Tinnings to adopt an infant boy who they named Michael in 1978. But as the Tinnings were going through the adoption process, Marybeth became pregnant once more and gave birth to Mary Frances on October the 29th, 1978. The arrival of Mary Frances meant that the Tinnings had 2 children at the home at the same time, which certainly was strange for them. But those who knew them said they handled it very well. Family and friends thought that Marybeth and Joe were finally on their way to having the family that they always wanted. But then, in January, though the horrible pattern repeated itself where Marybeth brought Mary Frances into the emergency room, yes, you guessed it, unresponsive. And then in another twist to this very tragic case, the doctors were able to revive her. Mary Frances was sent back home with her parents. Unfortunately, this was a death sentence for her, because a month later, Marybeth brought Mary Frances into the hospital again, but this time the doctors were unable to revive her. It appears that Marybeth Tinning made sure that her child wouldn't survive the second time. But Marybeth Tinning was far from done having children or from murdering them. The Tinnings welcomed Jonathan into the family on 19th of November 1979, and in March 1980 he was brought to the hospital in much the same condition as his previously doomed siblings. Medical professionals took a second and a third and a fourth look at this case. It was now in the 1980s, and a new generation of healthcare workers who didn't know about the Tinnings were in charge of things, and computers made it easy for them to look at background records. Care professionals were concerned with all the deaths in the Tinning family, but still thought that maybe it was genetically related. Others thought maybe it had something to do with the family home. Still, no one suspected Marybeth yet. And for whatever reason, Joe never seemed to suspect a thing either. The concerned professionals decided to send a little Jonathan to Boston, where he could be examined by a specialist. The specialist could find nothing wrong with him, so they sent him home. Jonathan's death was a straw that broke the camel's back for many county healthcare and law enforcement officials. Little Jonathan died on March the 24th, 1980. The sheer number of deaths in the Tinning family was enough alone to cause suspicions, but the deaths also seemed to fit a pattern. Most of the children died in the fall, winter and early spring months, and 2 of them on holidays. The dates of the death would suggest that depression played a role. Those suspicions began to grow, however, when Marybeth brought Michael to the family's paediatrician on 2nd of March 1981. Marybeth told the doctor that Michael went to sleep and couldn't wake him up. The doctor didn't have to look very hard at the child to see that he was dead. 8 of Marybeth Tinning's children are now dead. Michael's death caused so much interest because he was brought to the family's paediatrician instead of the emergency room. But even more suspicious is that he was adopted, proving that the Tinning curse was not genetic. But Marybeth Tinning would claim one last victim before she was finally brought to justice. The IQ level of Joe Tinning must have been seriously low. Any more normal husband with a normal IQ could seriously begin to question the role of his wife in the deaths of all of his children, especially if he considered that his wife was the last person to be with the child before each death. Based on that alone, one would have to think that the husband in question was either really stupid or possibly involved in the crime. Or maybe he was just pathetic. By all accounts, it seems that Jones was pathetic. Maybe he thought something was going on, but he was too weak to say anything, or perhaps too scared. Remember, this is the same guy who was poisoned by his wife, yet he not only refused to have her prosecuted, but took her back with open arms. Joan desired a stable marriage, and he was going to have that, even if it meant at the lives of his children. By 1985, Joe Tinning must have realised something was going on in his house. He couldn't ignore the carnage that was taking place under his roof. In 1985, the Tinnings welcomed their last child into their home, Tammy Lynn. At this point, people in the area were wondering about the Tinnings and their seamlessly endless possession of dead children. On 19th of December 1985, Tammy Lynn became the final child to die at Marybeth's hands. Unlike all previous Tinning children who were brought to the hospital, Tammy Lynn was discovered dead in the Tinnings' home by a neighbour. There seemed to be no credible reason for her death, which led to the police to seriously consider foul play, and Marybeth, at last, was the suspect. The county sheriff's department finally started taking a serious look into Marybeth Tinning after her 9th child died. The fact that 9 of her children died under her care was bad enough, but that made things worse and more suspicious that all of her children died under her watch. Investigators began questioning the doctors and nurses who had treated the Tinning children before making their way to friends and families, and then finally Marybeth herself. Marybeth knew that it was coming, and she went into the sheriff's department for questioning, but it didn't take her long to confess. "I smothered her with a pillow," Tinning said about Tammy Lynn. She claimed to have not remembered much about the murder, but never gave a real reason, but it was enough to charge her with murder and bring her to trial. Marybeth Tinning was convicted of 1 count of second-degree murder on July the 17th, 1987, and sentenced to 20 years to life in prison. But there were still very many unanswered questions about the case, particularly, did Marybeth Tinning kill all 9 of her children? The people of the North Central certainly wanted to know the answer, and so did the authorities, so the bodies of the babies were exhumed. Although the exhumations were examined and it never led to any more charges, it did reveal another interesting aspect of the case. Joe Tinning's behaviour during his wife's killing spree was important because he was either woefully ignorant or complicit in the crimes. When his children were being exhumed, Joe Tinning didn't seem to care, and when questioned, he had difficulty remembering all of their names. Marybeth was sent to the women's maximum security prison in Bedford Hills, New York, to serve her time, but was not forgotten by the people of Saguenay County. Joe Tinning continued to support his wife. He drove down to visit her regularly and never even considered a divorce. For her part, Marybeth avoided major problems with other inmates and staff in prison, although she wasn't very popular among her peers due to the nature of her crimes. Finally, due to her time served, she awaited trial and changes in the good time status in New York Department of Corrections. Marybeth Tinning was eligible now for parole in 2007. Surely she wouldn't be released, would she? Well, she was denied parole largely due to statements she made herself. She refused to take responsibility for what she did, stating she couldn't remember much about the murder. After she was denied parole, she was eligible to go before the board every 2 years, and in that time, several things changed. Beside her husband, Marybeth Tinning started gaining some supporters who believed that she was a victim of a psychological disorder called Munchausen syndrome by proxy. Her supporters argued that Marybeth Tinning was a victim of mental illness and was a perfect example of how those afflicted with mental illness once used to fall through the cracks. They argue that if she were younger in the current system, she would have been caught and received treatment after the first child died. It's hard to say, though, if this was true or not, but the arguments did gain support of some very influential people. Tinning's supporters petitioned the parole board and helped her craft better responses to the parole board's questions. "After the deaths of my other children, I just lost it," she said. "I became damaged, worthless piece of a person. And when my daughter was young, in my state of mind at that time, I believed she was going to die like the others, so I just did it." Marybeth Tinning was in her 80s. She was released from prison on the 21st of August, was reunited with her husband and moved back to her county, where she will be under state prison supervision for the rest of her life. One of the many provisions of her release prohibits her from being around children. Hopefully, she'll follow that provision. Go to Fatal Files podcast and you'll find the Kill Amongst playlist. Let's give a thought and a prayer for the victims of Marybeth Tinning.